Hey everybody, welcome to another Games That Infuriate Me to No End. Been quite a while since I've done one of these, isn't it? Well, that's because very few games actually do infuriate me to no end, but this is one of them. And oddly enough, it's not because of the game itself. Let me go ahead and get the game itself out of the way. This is Broken Sword the Sleeping Dragon, also known as Broken Sword 3. And you're probably noticing something right off the bat, and that's that I don't have any gameplay footage for it. And there's a very good reason for that, but I'll get to that in a moment. The game itself was developed by Revolution Software and published by a variety of publishers back in November of 2003, and it was released for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. And I was set to review this thing, ready to go. I had my audio all recorded, I just needed gameplay footage, and therein lied the problem. But I'll come back to that. First, let's talk about the game itself. So first things first, this is the third game in the Broken Sword series, and is the first game in the series to actually have 3D visuals. In fact, this is a straight-up 3D adventure game, as opposed to the point-and-click adventure games that every single other game in the entire series is. So, that came with it a few differences in design choice. For example, the controls are now keyboard only because you're moving around with them and things like that, or you're using a gamepad. It was pretty obviously designed for console. But even then, it does have some pretty impressive things about it. For example, the visuals. It looked rather good for its time, as far as adventure games go anyway. It certainly has issues, definitely looking back on it, and some of the stuff is rather jagged and undetailed, and it's definitely aged rather poorly in more ways than one, but again, I'll get to that in a moment. And the sound design is fairly uninspired. I mean, it's still got some pretty solid music for the most part. It's stuff you've come to expect from Broken Sword. The voice acting ranges from rather good, for example, George Stobart's voiceovers, to downright atrocious, like some of the French voiceovers, but I get the feeling that they're more just played up to be corny than anything else, and you can kind of get past that. But it's clearly aged, and particularly in the visual side of things, it has not aged particularly well. But when it comes down to it, what you really play a Broken Sword game for are the story and the gameplay, with the story being kind of the big draw and the gameplay being the secondary because it's an adventure game and you know that it's going to be a bunch of puzzles, but the story is what really matters here and how well the puzzles actually serve the story. And the story in this is basically that you're playing once again, mostly as George Stobart, but occasionally as Nico Collard, as they investigate various things. It starts off with George investigating in the Congo, where he's supposed to meet with a professor, only he finds that the professor was apparently involved in something shady and ended up getting killed for it. So, thus begins the investigation that sends him all over the place. And meanwhile, Nico Collard has found a hacker who has supposedly cracked the Voynich manuscript. If you don't know what the Voynich manuscript is, it is a manuscript that is completely indecipherable. Nobody has any clue what it's written in, if it's written in anything at all. It could just be a completely random collection of symbols, and it's entirely possible that it means nothing. Who knows? We can't translate it. And so a hacker being able to translate it is a fairly big deal. But of course, Nico finds out he's been killed too, and it was involved in some shady stuff. Of course, that all brings Nico and George back together, and they go off on their investigative adventure to find out what's going on with that, investigating this kind of secret society that's, of course, up to no good with supernatural entities. But ultimately, the plot ends up being rather corny, and unlike the previous two games, it feels corny, and not in a good way. You see, there's the kind of corny that's really charming and endearing, and then there's what happens with this, where it just feels kind of hackneyed and stupid. And it doesn't help that, while some of the characters are fairly strong, others just fall completely flat on their faces and get pretty annoying, actually. And so you have these kind of wild ups and downs where some things about it are really well written and other things really aren't, and it's just so wildly inconsistent with it that you kind of lose interest pretty quickly. But if that weren't enough, then you go to the gameplay, which is painfully dull. And it's in no small part due to the way that they have altered the controls. See, like I said, this is a 3D adventure game instead of a point-and-click game, which means that the keyboard is your controller on PC, unless you somehow manage to get a gamepad to work with it. Or if you were playing on console, obviously you have a gamepad. And it's obvious that it was meant for gamepad, because the controls feel awkward and clumsy. And so you're constantly having to deal with moving in awkward positions and trying to manipulate it so that you actually are in the right location to do the action that you're wanting to do. Then you had to hit the right button to interact a certain way with whatever it is you're trying to interact with, and ultimately the controls just end up being this completely cumbersome mess that just gets irritating rather than anything else. But they had to design puzzles around this. And one of the big problems with that is that a huge portion of the puzzles in this game are painfully easy. It's basically just moving blocks around. Or you might have to shift something in the environment a certain way, so now you've got a different pattern popping up, and oh, this suddenly works, or now you've moved the block into place so you can actually climb up to a certain area. The puzzles themselves are just completely weak. Moving block puzzles are not entertaining, they are not challenging, and they never have been. It's like those stupid sliding block puzzles where you have to manipulate the various blocks of an image so that it will display the image properly, and that'll usually unlock something. That is extremely simplistic puzzle design. It's the kind of puzzle design that's boring, because it doesn't require thought. It requires trial and error. Now, a bit of that in a given game is perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. But if almost the entire game requires almost no thought, what's the point? It's an adventure game. You're supposed to think about the puzzles. You're not supposed to just go on autopilot and instantly figure everything out without even actually thinking. That's just boring. It's tedium. And that's precisely what happens with this game. That alone is enough to make it a very mediocre game. And thus, I would have given it a 2 out of 5 when I was going to review it. Unfortunately, I can't review it. Not in a traditional sense, anyway. And the simple reason for that is that I can't get the damn thing to work. I have tried running it on 5 different PCs. It has worked on exactly one of them. The only one it works on is my really old XP machine that runs like crap. To give you an idea, that machine has a hard time running Quake 3. Let alone this game, and that's even at a resolution of things like 1024 by 768. So, while I was able to play through the game, I can't get any footage of it, and I can't even really reliably get screenshots on that PC because there's something wrong with it, and thus it doesn't interface with my screen capture software correctly. So, I can't even get good screenshots of it. It's just kind of a borked mess. And regardless of what system I've tried to run it on other than that, it will not start up. I can't even get to the main menu. And it's not even like I'm running a CD version or anything like that. I'm running the GOG version. It should work just fine, but it doesn't. And there's so few games that actually do that it just boggles my mind. I have no idea why this thing doesn't work. I can't remotely figure it out. I have tried all sorts of things. Nothing works. And thus I am left with a game that leaves me at wit's end. I've actually tried to review this thing like 5 times. And every single time I have tried to review it, it has done this exact same thing, where it will not work, and thus I can't get footage from it. And thus I am left scratching my head and ranting, because this game that is just fairly mediocre, it's only really worth playing if you're a kind of a die-hard Broken Sword fan. Like I said, it's not a terrible game, but it's just not really worth your time unless you want that bridge between Broken Sword 2 and 4. Otherwise, I would just recommend playing Broken Sword 1 and 2, and maybe playing 4 and 5. I actually have not played 4 and 5 yet, so I couldn't tell you if they're any good or not. But if you want that bridge between them, just to know what the adventure is between the Broken Sword 2 and 4, I guess play it. You could certainly do a lot worse, don't get me wrong. It's not a terrible game. Again, if you can get it on sale for cheap, then I guess it's worth owning. Or if you're trying to complete your collection or whatever. But it's just not entertaining. And even worse is that it's a complete crapshoot as to whether it's going to work or not. I don't know if the issue is purely on my end or not, but considering I've tried it across so many different computers and it has only worked on one of them, and this is the GOG version that should work, period, I don't know, there's something wrong with the game. So, be warned, you may have some issues getting this thing to work, and it may well infuriate you, like it does me, because I spent so much time trying to get this damn thing to work, and it would not work. So I feel like all of that time was completely wasted. And there are few things I hate more than feeling like I have wasted my time on something. So there you go, folks. Sorry I couldn't actually review the thing properly, but there you go. Thanks for watching.